May 31st and June 1st will mark 100 years since the Tulsa Race Massacre. A white mob stormed a black neighborhood in Tulsa's Greenwood district, leaving an estimated 300 people dead. Scholars have called it the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. Joining me to discuss this topic is Dr. Kristen Oertel. She's the chairperson of the Department of History at the University of Tulsa. Dr. Oertel, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Jordan.
So what do you teach your students about the Tulsa Race Massacre?
Well, first I'll begin with the context of the teens and 20s in U.S. history and the post-World War I racial tension that was common across American urban areas. There were a racial conflicts, armed racial conflicts in large cities all across the country. Of course, Red Summer in the summer of 1919. And so students need to understand that this just didn't emerge out of nowhere. It's part of a larger national struggle over race relations that really was acute at this point in time in post-World War I America.
Now, in some of my research, I've seen Greenwood referred to as Black Wall Street, and I've also seen it referred to as Little Africa, and I can't imagine that was done in an endearing way. So
no.
My question is, what was the Greenwood district like before the bombings, and why was it so special?
Yeah, the phrase Little Africa was a derogatory term used only by white Tulsans, and they used even worse phraseology to refer to the district that was, favorably referred to as Black Wall Street by Booker T. Washington, one of the most famous African Americans in the country, really in the world, in the 1920s. And Black Wall Street describes it more accurately because it was a thriving business district anchored by Greenwood Avenue and dozens of Black-owned businesses, schools, theaters, lawyers' offices, dentists, doctors. It was a self-contained, incredibly rich, both economically and culturally, region in the middle of Oklahoma.
Now, an incident at the Drexel building served as the catalyst for the massacre. So how did an interaction inside an elevator escalate all the way to an armed mob storming a neighborhood, killing Black residents, burning businesses, and leaving many people dead and homeless?
Yeah, so this incident that occurred in the elevator was relatively minor in modern terms. It would not even be termed sexual assault in modern times. It was perhaps a physical altercation, accidental by most accounts, and not intentional whatsoever. It appears that Dick Rowland, an African-American man, stumbled as he got onto an elevator and accidentally brushed against Sarah Page's arm. She screamed, and the story just kind of exploded from there, and it turned into, African-American man has assaulted a white woman. And of course, again, in that 1920s context of American history, that accusation of rape by Black men was commonly used to justify racial violence against Black communities. And so this trope of Black rapist was trumpeted around the community, and Dick Rowland is arrested. He's held at a courthouse downtown, and rightfully so, the Black community rallies around Rowland to protect him. They know he, from the minute the accusation occurs that he's vulnerable to lynching. Lynching is common at this point in time. And so they surround the courthouse. A white mob shows up, ready to, kidnap Roland basically and take him away and lynch him. And, the Black community stands up for itself and tries to protect one of its own, as they rightfully should have. And, again, the details are difficult to tease out and to verify, but by all accounts, there was a verbal argument between white and Black armed men outside the courthouse, which turned into a physical scuffle. Shots begin to ring out and people start dying. And the violence bleeds out into the streets of Tulsa, and the white community is emboldened by the police department and the sheriff's department's encouragement, basically, to attack Greenwood, to attack this thriving Black community and burn it to the ground.
Viola Ford Fletcher, the oldest living survivor of the massacre, she testified before a House committee on May 19th. She said because of the massacre, she never attended school beyond the 4th grade. So what was life like for survivors like her?
Well, the entire community, to over 1,200 businesses or buildings, residences, businesses were burned to the ground. And, they literally were sitting in ashes, stunned by what had just occurred in 48 hours. Their homes, their businesses, their livelihoods just went up in flames. Their family members were killed. Many people fled in terror the night of the massacre. Those who fled temporarily came back to find nothing, right? And, of course, now we would call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. This community had been traumatized, and which makes the fact that it rebuilt all the more remarkable. But families like Miss Fletcher's, some of them just could never recover. And of course, it takes time and money to rebuild. And, at age 7, I believe she was at the time of the massacre, her elementary school was burned to the ground. So she had nowhere to go. Yes, Greenwood would rebuild, and it rebuilt impressively. By the 1930s, it was thriving again. By that time, though, Miss Fletcher, was an adult.
Do you remember when you first learned of what happened in Greenwood? Because so many adults don't learn about this until they are well out of school. And a lot of people learned about it when HBO debuted its show Watchmen. Mm-hmm. So what was the scale of the cover-up effort?
Yeah, it's remarkable to me, the silence around this event until very recently. Literally in the last decade, I think the city of Tulsa has begun to reckon with this ugly piece of its past. But I was a history major in college. I went on to a graduate degree. I did not learn about the race massacre until graduate school in a class on African American history, right? So it wasn't even an American history class. It was focused on African American history. And I don't think most people learn about this event in their American history classes. When I first arrived at the University of Tulsa in 2010, I had students in my classroom from Booker T. Washington High School, which is, one of the most prominent high schools, historically Black high schools in the city. I had students in my classroom who didn't learn about the race massacre at that high school in the 1990s, in the early 2000s. That's no longer the case. And I know there were certain teachers throughout Tulsa's history who were, teaching this important work, but most were not, and certainly it was not in the history books. Thankfully, that is changing, particularly because of the centennial and the increased attention on the event.
So how did the media cover the massacre?
The media at the time covered it extensively. The Tulsa paper certainly covered it. The Oklahoma City paper covered it. I found stories about the massacre all across the country. St. Louis papers covered it. Kansas City papers covered it. New York City. America, and especially Black American newspapers, were well aware of the destruction that occurred. And it was reported throughout the month of June and even subsequent to that. And so that, again, makes it all the more remarkable that it was, the news about this was silenced for decades in between 21 and the, early 2000s.
Now, in recent years, efforts have been made to call this a race massacre instead of calling it the Tulsa Race Riot, which it was known for a long time. Mm-hmm. Why was it so important to reclassify this as a massacre?
Well, first of all, the fact that it was classified as a riot basically disqualified the victims of this racial violence from making insurance claims, because insurance does not cover destruction as a result of a riot. And also, I think the word riot often has a connotation of sort of radical Black Americans causing trouble. And this is not what happened, right? This was a threatened lynching of a Black man by a white mob that instigates racial conflict and explodes into a massacre of not just Black bodies, but Black property, Black generational wealth. And I think massacre is an essential shift in the meaning of what really happened that day.
What is Greenwood like today, and how has Tulsa chosen to reckon with this tragedy? Yeah, so Greenwood has rebuilt several times, right? It is incredibly resilient. Black Tulsans have demonstrated their resilience over and over again. As I mentioned before, after the massacre, Greenwood rose from the ashes, and even more Black businesses thrived in the 1930s and 40s than had been in existence in the 1920s. Unfortunately, what some people refer to as urban renewal, then also destroyed Greenwood a second time, right? So a huge highway, interstate highway, was built and bisected that community. Basically, eminent domain forced much of the important buildings and land in Greenwood to be turned over to the state and federal government for building this highway. So in the 1960s, the community was basically ransacked again by eminent domain. And yet it survived, right? The churches still survived. There's still some Black-owned businesses. I really see Greenwood Avenue and the Greenwood District going through another renaissance. And again, thanks in part to the attention to the event from the centennial, people recognize we need to support Black businesses. We need to support Greenwood and its continued success. Mm-hmm. Well, that takes care of all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you want the people to know about the race massacre?
There's so much more, and I would encourage you to educate yourself. Check out one of the dozens of books that have come out in the last year or two. about the race massacre, about Black Wall Street, about Black Oklahoma, the all Black towns in this nation, the Black Indian roots of this community. So much of this history is still not known by most of Americans. And the books are there, the documentaries are there, so please absorb them, as many as you can.
And speaking of books, you told me about a book you worked on about racial and gender violence.
Yes, so racial violence has been a part of my research since my graduate school days. My first book, Bleeding Borders, Race, Gender, and Violence in Pre-Civil War Kansas, looks at conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers on the Kansas-Missouri border, so just north of Tulsa, in the 1850s, and kind of the spark that lit the Civil War.
And where can we find your book?
You can find it at Louisiana State University Press or Amazon or any of your local booksellers.
All right. Well, it takes care of all of my questions. Thank you again for joining me.
Thank you, Jordan.